Hello, and welcome to the second Hangout on Air, live Hangout on Air of the Home Mastering Masterclass. I've just pasted in the chat window next to the video a link where any of you guys can join in on the call with us. We've got some other course members and some friends of mine here, so you're welcome to join in if you would like, or feel free to just sit and watch. And we'll get right down to answering some questions. I haven't got a huge number of questions prepared in advance for this, which hopefully means I'm doing a great job on the course and that you don't need to ask any questions. But feel free, people who are listening in on the call with me, to kind of interject for clarifications or with your comments if you would like. The more the merrier. The first question is from Samuel, and it's actually one that I didn't answer from the previous Hangout. I had a couple of messages get lost along the way, but I thought it was a really good question that other people might have. Because I've answered Samuel by email, but I thought I would go through it anyway. So he says, I recently finished a rescue job for an associate's EP and was never happier with my work as an engineer until Dynameter gave me PLR readings ranging from 16 to 20 on nearly every song. Unfortunately, this project had to be optimized for loudness on YouTube, and the most important parts of each song already ranged from 8 to 10 minimum PSR. So in a rushed panic, I ended up crushing any of the less important parts that I could get away with as low as PSR 5 in order to bring the PLR averages up as close to 12 as I could. So hopefully, if you're on the course, you're kind of aware of what that terminology means, but just quickly to decode that. So PSR is the difference between the short-term difference between the loudness and the peak level. So the louder the music, the higher the loudness gets, the closer to the peak, the smaller the PSR. And my minimum recommended is PSR 8, just like my minimum recommended when I was using the TT meter was DR 8. PLR is the longer term measure over a whole song, tends to be several points higher than the minimum PSR because it kind of includes the most songs are not the same loudness all the way through and not at maximum loudness all the way through. And PLR is the one that can be useful for judging how songs are going to be treated by loudness management systems online. So Samuel follows up by saying there has to be a better way to do this. So what he's saying is that he was happy with the sound of his song, but when he measured the PLR, it was much higher. I mean, if he's going for YouTube, our recommended target for YouTube in the terms of PLR is 12, with a minimum PSR of 8 as usual. So him getting 16 to 20, that means that his song needs too much loudness space to fit into what YouTube offer us. And they wouldn't be able to turn it up without causing clipping distortion. So typically they don't turn stuff like that up. So his song would be 3, 4, 5 dBs quieter probably than other material on YouTube. So obviously that when loudness is a priority, that's a problem. So he's saying there has to be a better way of doing this than just crushing the whole song. But I really didn't know where to begin, and any advice you could give would be greatly appreciated. So I actually it's a tough question to ask without hearing an example. So I got Samuel to send me his song and took a listen to it. And before I even put the meters on it, the first thing I noticed was that the intro was quite a lot quieter than the loudest sections of the song. And so I automated, from memory, I think I automated an extra 7 dBs of gain in the intro to the song. I hope Samuel doesn't mind me revealing this to people on the call. We're all friends here, Samuel. I mean, it kind of seems to be flying against the face of what I normally say, which is that I like dynamics, but it's all, like I say, it's all a question of balance. And my feeling musically was that that intro was going to be too quiet given what came afterwards. When the beat kicked in, it was just too much. It took me too much. I was taken aback by it. So just for musical reasons, I lifted up that intro. And then listening to it overall, I thought, well, it sounds really good, but I don't think there's any harm in lifting this a couple of dBs further up against the limiter. The song kind of had a really big bass line towards the end in the loudest section, which had a lot of energy in it. So that kind of, I think, ideally, I would probably have lifted the song 3 dBs louder than he had it. I decided, given the way the bass line sounded, 2 dBs would be more like it. If I'd actually been mastering the song, I mean, actually, overall, it sounded really good and really balanced, but I would probably have just tamed some of the energy in that bass line slightly so that I could have lifted the overall level higher. So those were the musical decisions that I made. And then I put Dynameter on it because he'd already told me the measurements for the song. And I was pleased to find that, oh, so there's one final adjustment, which is that he had the song peaking at -1. Excuse me, he had the song peaking at 0. And as you know, I now recommend a maximum peak level of -1. So I adjusted that in the limiter as well. So with a gain lift of 2 and a reduction in the peak level of 1, I was basically adding an extra 3 dBs of limiting to his song. But it was pretty, it was well managed dynamically, but it wasn't kind of super spiky. That wasn't going to be a huge problem with a decent limiter. So then I ran the numbers, and it came out as PLR 13 with a minimum PSR of 8, which I'm completely happy with. So the advice that I went back to Samuel with was to exactly that, to raise the introduction level for musical reasons, but also because that lifts up the PLR reading, or rather reduces the PLR reading down because it brings the loudness level of the intro up closer to the peak. And then that extra 3 dB of limiting that I added just kind of controlled the peaks enough to give an overall reading so that you could be confident. I mean, it's difficult to say because we don't know exactly how YouTube's loudness management algorithm works. Maybe it would have ignored the fact that it had a quiet introduction. I didn't actually check where the peak levels of that introduction were. If they were well below 0, it's quite possible that YouTube would have simply turned the song up as far as Samuel wanted it anyway. But having got the PLR 13 reading from Dynameter, I can be confident that YouTube is going to play that at a similar, because YouTube's target loudness is -13. And actually, I don't think that they worry too much about where the peak level is. So that song was going to get played back exactly where Samuel wanted it to be. I thought it worked better from a musical point of view. And I mean, the only place where you would have any concerns would be on Spotify, where there's only a PLR 11 available to you. But in that case, it would probably just get a little bit of extra limiting, some light limiting from Spotify's limiter, which, you know, I mean, depending on your point of view, may or may not be a good thing. But I think I prefer not to compromise the overall dynamics for the sake of one platform. I would prefer to go for the sweet spot where I think it'll work well everywhere else. And if there's a little bit of extra limiting on Spotify, well, there's probably a little bit of extra limiting on everything of that nature on Spotify anyway. So that was the advice that I gave to Samuel, and kind of to sort of boil that down, you know, rather than doing what he did in a bit of a panic and just turn the whole song up, resulting in some of the loudest sections being very crushed in order to force that PLR value to be lower. Instead, I used automation, and if that hadn't been enough, then maybe I would have used some extra gentle compression to just manage. I mean, because I think if the dynamics are right, it's going to work. So there wouldn't need to be any extra anything else done. But if I discovered that his song was maybe more dynamic than I think it needed to be, then a little bit of gentle control would be enough to bring that down, rather than just pushing everything hard into a limiter and causing the minimum PSR value to get very low, which would have a very crushed sound and might potentially sound distorted or whatever. So yeah, Samuel was pleased with that answer, and I think it got the result that he was looking for. So hopefully that's useful to you guys too. Did that make sense? Does anybody have any questions before I move on to the next one, or any comments?
It does, Andres. I was just about to type a question. When you do an automation in that way, last time you talked specifically about how, depending on when you're doing several songs for a long play or something like this, you take a story on the different sounds and how they interpret each one with each other. When you automate that first part of the song, and let's say you come from one that's very dynamic and moved, and this one you need to start low and then go a little bit higher, is that going to affect how the people are going to perceive the song at that time? Because in the end, yes, we're pulling everybody a little bit up, but this one is pulling a little bit more. So the dynamic from the lowest part to the highest part, and at the song, not at the dynamic range, it's going to change.
Fair enough. I think we're lucky that, I mean, even Spotify, but particularly YouTube, I think, I like Apple's choice of a loudness level the most because it gives us the most flexibility, right? Their reference level is -16. So you've got 15 dBs of PLR to work with. That's plenty of room for all but maybe some classical music needs more dynamic range than that, but I think loudness optimization or management with classical is less critical. With pop and rock and jazz and folk, PLR 15 is ample in my experience. I mean, the most dynamic example on my infographic about the different DR values was Brothers in Arms by Dire Straits, which was 100% digital recording, pretty old school, and that comes out, I think, as DR 16. So that's probably something like PLR 16 as well. So I like Apple for that reason. But in fact, YouTube, I mean, that's kind of the exception to the rule. If you look at the other example, there's a ton of really loud, but also great dynamically music on that list that only measures PLR. I mean, so let's take a recent example. Stephen Wilson's last album came out as PLR 12, I think. The James Blake album that I gave the Dynamic Range Day Award to overall came out as PLR 14. And that's much more mellow. It's not nearly as aggressive. So, PLR 12, 13 on YouTube, I think that's about right. That's so, I've been teaching or recommending the levels that I do on this course as, don't go any louder than this for years. And that's based on my own experience as a mastering engineer. And I kind of, I was influenced by the loudness war as much as anybody else, I guess, up until about the year 2000, I guess. Or maybe a little bit before, but round about that time, it kind of got to the point where I thought, actually, I'm going to stop. I don't want to follow this trend. I don't want to make my stuff as loud as Californication by the Chili Peppers or What's the Story, Morning Glory by Oasis, which were the albums that were around at the time, and kind of early examples of the loudness war. So that's where I kind of set my personal benchmark, and I stuck with it ever since. So I did that for musical reasons. We didn't have any loudness management or anything else around there. And I mean, you could say it's a nice coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence at all. I think YouTube have chosen their loudness management level wisely based on the range of material that's out there and what you need to make stuff sound good. So that's a long-winded way of saying, in my experience, if you aim for these kind of targets, you're going to get stuff that works musically. So in your example, you were asking about something that's really quite dynamic coming into this one where I decided to push the intro up. I mean, don't forget, I decided to push the intro up for musical reasons first. I didn't kind of look at it and go, okay, how am I going to manufacture a PLR that's going to work? I listened to it and thought, for me, if I were mastering that, I would make that intro louder. So now if I put that that's one song. If I put that in the context of an album and it was coming out of a really quiet song, possibly then I might have made a different decision and I might have not turned that intro up quite as much. But, that happens a lot. You have a quiet song that fades out, or, there's just a long, slow fade, or just it feels gentle. And then the next thing comes in and you chose your level based on the loudest section at the end. And when you hear the intro, it just hits you too hard, hits you too loud. So at that point, I would probably use automation to go the other way. And that's always the way that I would prefer to do it. I guess there's a thorny area there where if the client wants it to be optimized for streaming loudness, so to playback with maximum loudness on YouTube and to work musically, I think then you're into a balancing act. Then it's a case of trying to explain the issues. And I guess if they were adamant, that this was going to be the single, and it had to work on YouTube, but then I would probably suggest doing 2 masters. I don't generally suggest doing multiple masters. I like to have one master that works, translates to any platform. But if they want something that kind of conflicts with what works well musically in the context of an album, which I think is what you're asking, then I wouldn't want to compromise the experience for somebody listening to the album for the sake of the online streaming services. So at that point, I might suggest 2 separate masters. And the same thing might apply if somebody, in general, lots of people are looking at the information that I'm putting out about the online loudness and assuming that I'm recommending that you do multiple versions optimized for each platform. And actually, I kind of feel like life's too short for that. I would prefer to do one version that works well on the vast majority of platforms, just like in the example I was just giving, and if Spotify has to do something a little bit to it, well, I don't think that's the end of the world. But if a client specifically requested, if they wanted, so for example, the new Avenged Sevenfold album is really dynamic, particularly for a metal album. And it's so dynamic that it would get quite a bit of extra limiting on Spotify, or possibly not get turned up far enough. In fact, I think last time I compared it on Spotify, it sounded a little bit quieter than other stuff, even when loudness management was on. So in that situation, I think if the client was saying to me, this is really important to us, meaning being loud in a streaming platform, then I would suggest that they should probably do a separate master with a few dBs more limiting, just for that one use case. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Excellent. I'm not seeing anything else, so I shall move on to the next question. Okay, thanks, John. Nice to see you. Cheers, Sia Godora. I will learn how to say your name properly one of these days.
Ian, can you hear me?
I can. Who's that?
That's Sebastian.
Oh, yeah.
Before we go to the next question, I have to say that lately I was working also with Dynameter on my stereo bus while mixing.
Uh-huh.
And I have to say it's amazing tool for mixing.
Oh, good.
I am really so happy with that, because on the end, when I would get best of our mix, I would just run the Dynameter through the mix, and I would find some things that would just stick out, that would get the PSR lower than 8. And the way I would, I'm still experiencing, so I don't have like really fast opinion about this. But I would just start muting the tracks and finally I would find one that would cause the problem. And it could be different. It could be very various. For example, EQing or limiting or too less limiting, because we're always talking about over limiting or compressing. But it happened a couple of times in the mix for me that I would just compress too little. So I have to say, it's a great tool for mastering, but it's an amazing tool for mixing. So I'm really happy with the big brother.
No, that's great. That's good to hear. Thank you. Because I mean, it was very much designed with a mastering point of view in mind. But yeah, I mean, in the new trailer that I've done, because another thing you can do is you can put multiple instances of Dynameter across as many tracks in the mix as you like. So you can kind of see on a track by track basis how the different dynamic elements break down, which can be quite interesting for the same reasons that you're describing, in the sense of just seeing where the dynamic elements of the mix are. It's a great way of getting a feel. I'm going to do a tutorial video that shows that, because I think it's a good way of getting a feel of how it works and how the dynamics works. So while I've got you, do you think because I spent a long time fine tuning the color coding for the loud stuff to make sure that it kind of, well, it looked pretty when you get it right, in my opinion. And we, to some extent, started to run out of colors, and found calibrating the more dynamic areas tricky. So did you kind of have any tracks where it was just all blue or all purple? And if that happened, did that worry you or concern you, or did you find it kind of...
Well, not really, because I hope to fix it in mastering after all. But yeah, I would get them. There would be like these quiet parts when the band would just drop down for one bar and then pick it up, then would go purple. But no, I wasn't really worried about that.
Sure.
As I say, I will worry while mastering, probably.
No, that's fair enough. Absolutely. Well, and that's kind of, I mean, that is what I recommend is I don't think we should be too concerned about the overall dynamics when you're mixing. I mean, I say that you should be, but purely from a musical point of view. And I do think, yeah, there's some value there. I think not necessarily you, but I think there are lots of people out there who are crushing things and squashing things without realizing, unintentionally. They start mixing, they get some overlevel. Somebody says, "Oh, put a limiter on the output bus." They do that, and it fixes the problem for them, and then everything just gets pushed really hot through there. And unless you're kind of looking for that problem, they wouldn't necessarily hear it. Whereas hopefully, if they had dynameter on the output bus, they would see it getting really squashed and go that horrible brownish grey color. And kind of think, oh, hang on, what's happening here, and go back and trace it through. So no, that's really good to hear. And we're also working on a new version of Perception that is going to be optimized for mixing as well. I don't know whether you have Perception, but that's
yeah, I do.
Okay, so that's something that's been very ever since we released it, we've had requests to make it more mixing friendly. So I'm quite excited about. I'm hoping that will get a great result when it's released. But no, thank you. It's good to get some good feedback.
Thank you.
I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I can do it now. I'll do it later. Depends. I don't know why I was using Perception, whereas I was trying to master two songs. They're like Latino music, kind of reggae Latino mood. And when I tried to compare the level of the song on when the effect chain happened, I don't know why the reading said it was really close. It was like when it turns, I think, red. Just in case, I'm the person who usually asks you because I'm the colorblind guy.
Okay.
I think it's red.
Okay.
And it turns into a +1. So I said sync, or I think it was one of the buttons that levels things up so you have the good perception. And all of a sudden it turns the window and says, if we are going to change this, it's going to be increasing more than 11 decibels. And I'm like, why? Why is this happening?
Okay. That's probably, I mean, without knowing exactly what you're comparing, but probably because your source is quite a lot quieter than your before is quite a lot quieter than your after. Yeah, because Perception does two things. It turns the after level down.
Yep.
But it also turns the before level up. So it doesn't go like that, and it doesn't go like that. It goes like this to the
midpoint.
To a mid, yeah, depending on where you started out. I mean, and that's at a reference. That's at -16 LUFS, which you can adjust in the settings. So probably all that was telling you was that we were going to have to turn the source up more than 11 dBs to get it to that reference level. And so it probably didn't matter. What I usually do when that happens is turn the monitor gain down. We introduced that warning because in some situations you could get people could get blasted by unexpectedly loud levels, and we didn't want people to be shocked and surprised by that. I think there are far fewer circumstances now when that happens. I don't know whether the code has got more clever, or I've lost track now in the development cycle about why that is. And I think probably we don't need that warning. I mean, one thing to say is if you lift the source level that much, there's a good chance you're going to get clipping on the source, which probably doesn't matter that much, because if it's just a little bit of clipping and it's on something that's very dynamic anyway, it's probably not that audible. But if you wanted to avoid that, you would turn your reference level down. It's an information thing. But like I say, I usually turn the volume down, hit the button, and then turn it back up slowly just to make sure that I'm not going to accidentally blast myself with noise. I think I'm starting to remember there was one situation where if there was low-level noise in the system, the perception gates out a certain amount of analog noise, but you could, in theory, have some noise that was a little bit. If you had a really quite noisy system, perception could think that that was signal, and if it was measuring that at one point, would think, well, I have to turn this up by like 48 dBs. And if it did that, and then somebody jumped to a point where actually the signal wasn't quiet anymore, but was the music, that level would be horrifying for them. Okay. So that's why the message pops up. So give that a try next time it happens. Okay. See whether that makes sense, and if not, give me a shout and we can look into it a bit more. Because it's always possible there's something not quite working out right. But yeah, that would be what I'd expect.
Okay, great.
Okay, excellent. So we now have 3 questions by Gautier. Hope that's how I pronounce his name. He asked to be on the call, but I don't see him here. I'm just going to check my email and make sure he's not trying to get in and can't get in for some reason. No, I'm not seeing anything there. Just flick across to the YouTube channel. Oh, never mind. Gautier, if you're not in yet and you would like to be, and you're watching this now, on the YouTube page from the link that I gave you in the email, to the right-hand side of that, there's a link where you should be able to join in and chat to us now. But so let's go through the questions. Number 1, in one of the interviews, you mentioned briefly the idea of delivering a mix with the vocal part louder. Can you explain how this can help at the pre-mastering stage? I forget exactly what it was that I meant at the time, but there are kind of a couple of reasons that I might say that might be helpful. One of them is that when you apply dynamic control to a mix, it can seem to change sometimes the interrelationship of the parts within the mix, especially if you're using multiband processing. And I have had instances where actually, I've been happy with everything else about the way that something has turned out, but for example, the vocal sounds a little bit more buried afterwards. I mean, that can happen because of EQ as well, and a bunch of other factors. So, having the option of a vocal up mix can sometimes be helpful, because when you hear something mastered in its mastered context, you just would have liked a little bit more of that. In fact, I just had an album today where client was really happy. They came back, the one alteration was they sent me another mix where they had turned the vocal up in one of the songs slightly. But I think what I was talking about in the interview you're talking about was that the other nice thing that happens when you have an upfront vocal, especially if you're using multiband compression, is that the compression works on the vocal, obviously, and controls it dynamically, and it pushes it down. And of course, the backing goes down with it. But then when the vocal stops, there's less compression happening. So the backing can kind of come back up. So it's a little bit like an auto ducking situation, where you have, if you have a vocal level and when it comes in, it automatically turns something else down. It's not as extreme as that, but it's that kind of effect. And if you can set up kind of nice musical attack and release times and the amounts of compression that's happening, that can actually work quite nicely. And I have been told that that was something that Trevor Horn did with Seal's releases back in the day. He would have the vocal in the mix very up front and then compress it quite heavily at the mastering stage, so that you ended up with a final master where the vocal was very upfront, very in your face. But because of the extra dynamic control, it sat nicely within the mix as well. Whereas if you'd gone for something that sat well nicely within the mix and then squashed the whole thing, it might still have worked, but that vocal wouldn't necessarily have been right up there at the forefront in the same way. So that was basically what I was getting at. In fact, I've been doing that with the album I've been mixing for my friend Dan recently, having his vocals right up there, and then a fair bit of dynamic control at the mastering stage, and it just kind of glues everything together, holds it all in, and you end up with a vocal that's really nice and in your face, but doesn't stick out, doesn't leap out at you. And I think you could definitely achieve that in mixing as well, and possibly that's an even better goal. But it's a strategy that, if it's good enough for Seal, maybe it's good enough for us. Yeah, Sebastian, do you have a comment?
I was actually watching lately a tutorial about that, of somebody that would be doing it while mixing, would duck the whole band according to the vocal, and I was just curious. It sounded very musical, because the right attack and release time was perfect, and it was really good choice. Although I was a little bit worrying how it would come out in mastering because of a dynamic treatment, basically.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think you would have to hope that if somebody was doing that at the mix stage, they would get it right, so that you could use less dynamic processing in the mastering stage. I suspect if you had to compress it heavily, you might end up with too much of that effect. You can have too much of a good thing, which I guess is probably what you're wondering about.
Yeah,
that would be my instinct. But I mean, it would very much depend on the material and the backing and the arrangement and everything else. So it's, I think all of these things you have to, I mention these things because they're interesting. I don't think I would necessarily recommend that anybody does them, but it's quite a nice thing to have in the back of your mind as a possible, and if you're working on mastering something for a client and you're in that situation that I was, where you're really happy with everything, but the vocal is just, you think, oh, if only I could have a little bit more vocal, I don't think we should be afraid to ask for that. And I mean, some mixers by default send multiple mixes. So Chris Lord Algae, for one, I know will send, I think he sends 5 different versions. So I think he sends the mix with vocal up, just the backing with nothing, maybe the mix with BVs, and then one other, I can't remember what his other one was. And he just sends those as a package on every job that he does. I think basically because it saves him time and effort, because if he knows from experience, if he supplies those things to whoever is further down the chain from him, he's going to have less need to do recalls and alterations, which, when you're, I don't want to say production line, but I guess maybe that's not completely inappropriate with him. If you have a schedule and it's a mix a day and you're working get that stuff through, the less times you have to go back, the less alterations you have to do, the better. So yeah, I think a vocal up, vocal down is quite a common thing to send in. I prefer not to get it, if I'm honest, because it almost puts doubt in my mind, and I like to feel like what I'm being presented with is the artist's vision, and then to do the best that I can with it. But I would never, it wouldn't concern me to somebody sent me a vocal up version, for example.
And what would be your reaction if the vocal would be, for example, too dynamic? Because that can also be a problem that people are concerned about. Vocal sitting right in a mix. Would you send it back, or?
Yes. I mean, in general, I don't tend to send things back anyway. What I usually do is do the best that I can with it, and then say, hey, I think it would be even better if, and see how the client reacts. And if they kind of go, oh yeah, absolutely, no, let's do that, and which sometimes happens, or the other possibility is they kind of go, oh well, it is what it is, can we just go with it? Then I will let it go at that stage. So I tend not to kind of say, this is broken, fix it. That's just that's a kind of style thing as much as anything. I mean, there are mastering engineers who do that, and their clients love them for it. It's actually fairly rare that you get something. My experience is you can get away with murder, especially if you're using multi-band compression. There have been some things in my career that I have compressed really, really heavily. That's not to say they come out sounding squashed. It's just that they were really dynamic to begin with. And again, you have to judge it on a client by client basis. There are that tends to be people who are less experienced, and they either, they've heard that things should be as dynamic as possible, and they've kind of taken that to too much of an extreme, or they just don't want to use compression. They don't understand compression. And, in those kind of situations, actually, it's better for me to do the best that I can with what they've given me. And maybe that means that overall I have something that's not quite as controlled dynamically, because the only problem with too much dynamic control is if it sounds bad. So if you have something that sounds very dynamic and you put it through the processing and you can get a result that sounds great, it's all good. The only problem is when actually, it sounds ridiculous because you can hear the compression working in an unnatural way, or, it still doesn't glue together in the way that you hope, or, so in those situations, then I would go back to the client and ask whether they think there's, we can do anything to work on this. The other thing you can do is ask for stems, which, it's not, I don't particularly like doing it. I think it blurs the boundaries too much. But again, if there's a client where your feeling is, it's kind of an arrogant position to be in, but there are certain clients where you just know it's going to be more work helping them get the result that they wanted, working through that with them, than it is for you to just do it for them. And I like to think that, well, certainly there's a couple of cases where I've done that, and they kind of come back out and say, "Oh, what did you do? How did you?" And then you can say, "Well, you need to think about this and a bit more of that and all the rest of it." And that's something for them to think about going forward, rather than trying to get it right with this particular project. Because the other risk is that if you're trying to help somebody achieve something that they weren't managing to achieve before in the mix, because again, I know there's lots of mastering engineers who do kind of consider themselves educators and try and help their clients become better mixers, which is very honorable. But the risk is you then get into this kind of endless round of revisions and resubmissions, and that's kind of what I meant, but not quite. And I think, and then you're in this awkward situation where you want to charge more than they want to pay, or so yeah, for me, either just go with what I have, get the best result that I can. Maybe flag it up to the client, say, I had to kind of push this a little bit harder than I normally would. I hope you think it sounds all right. And they almost always do. But then I've been honest and kind of just flagged it up to them so that they don't feel bad about expressing a reservation if they have one. Sort of a due diligence, if you like. Or you can get a vocal stem in, and then I can put separate compression on the vocal on its own and get it to where I think it's going to sit nicely in the mix prior to applying the mastering compression. Yeah, thank you. That's right. My pleasure.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Regarding what you just said on revisions, I also listened to Graham Cook from the Recording Revolution. And there's this thing that he said regarding on, let's say, when you're a mixing engineer and you have to do revisions and several things with the client. In mastering, now that you're talking about this specific part of maybe giving your input and helping, always depending on the project, how many revisions would you consider is enough, or it's what you need to have when you're doing this with clients? 2 revisions after the first try? Or
I don't honestly have a hard and fast rule. Usually, most people, 1 set of revisions is enough, and if not, 2 sets of revisions is enough. Okay. So you might come back and they say, "Oh, can we have the gap between that and that shorter? That song, can we have that a little bit quieter? And is there enough bass overall?" So you do what they ask, and then they go, "Oh, no, that gap's too short now, and we were wrong about the overall level. So can we have it back at where it was? But that song's perfect." And usually at that point, we're all happy. That's the most common scenario. So I kind of have this kind of unofficial, if they then came back again and said, "And you know what, I've just realized that, whatever it is, I don't know, oh, such and such, now that you've made that change this as a song." Because I think I said this on one of the episodes of the podcast. What I like to do is I set my prices quite high, because it kind of, I find I get more satisfaction from working for people who care enough to want to pay a little bit more. Yeah, who are willing to pay. I feel they take what I'm doing more seriously. So it's there's a little bit of kind of a bar that people have to get over just in order to work with me. But also, it means that, you know, if I get a really easy job, then that's great. And I've made a nice amount of money, probably more than I would have done if I'd have charged it on an hourly rate. But, you know, who knows what their next album will be like. More often than not, actually, there's a few revisions needed, but I'm quite happy to do that without having to get into the whole, okay, but that's going to be an extra this, that, and the other with them. You know, I'm just happy and comfortable to do the alterations that are needed. So having said that, I think if I got beyond sort of 3 alterations level, it's not like there's a rule that I have that says no more than 3 alterations, but I think at some point alarm bells start to ring and you start to think, does this person actually really know what they want? You know, are these changes beneficial? You know, are they maintaining their perspective? And how am I going to get to an end of it? And at that point, I usually say, okay, yeah, I can do this set for you for free. But if we need any more alterations, I will have to charge, and it'll be this much. And that's the point where I kind of start to put the brakes on. The tricky thing then is every so often you find a client who's like, yep, absolutely fine. And I did have one client where the original quote was my standard mastering price of £795 for the project, and I ended up charging him £2,800.
You had that many questions?
I ended up virtually remixing the album. You know, I ended up having stems of almost every track, and you know, kind of multiple revisions and multiple tweaks. And it, you know, I mean, that was fine, because what was happening there was that's an example of that learning curve that I was talking about. But in that situation, you know, it's not like I fleeced him. He got value for money. You know, everything that he paid me to do was worthwhile and made the project better. Would it have been better for him to have got all of that right before he brought it to me for mastering? Yes, but actually he wouldn't have known that he needed to do that. You know, he got the project to where he felt he was happy with it and then brought it to me. And it was only after hearing it mastered that he realized that he wasn't happy with it. You know, that's one of those things, that kind of mindset thing of trying to, we've all had it. You know, you think you're happy with the mix, and then you go off and you listen to something else and you come back to it, and suddenly all these things jump out at you just because you kind of had this mental reset by listening to something else. And I think that was just a situation where, you know, that was true for him, but kind of 10 times over or something. But I have to be honest, I didn't, you know, it was kind of quite frustrating with that towards the end. So, and I guess that, you know, I don't know whether I had those ideas that I've just been talking about of, you know, ideally only X and then we start charging. But like I say, if somebody's prepared to pay, who are we to say, well, no, you're wrong. You know, you shouldn't be paying that. You know, he was where he was, and so it kind of worked out. But that's not an ideal situation for me at all.
But in that case, that gives me a good answer, because that's the point. That's a great example of the point where you go, the first thing when you charge, if you charge that amount and they're willing, they know that you're going to give them advice and you know what you're doing. And the other part was that person enabled you to see the specific threshold where you say, okay, yeah, after this much, I need to start charging you, because this has gone not from specifically a mastering, we have gone to another part, which is more of a mentoring of what's happening right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And another trigger would tend to be stems. You know, I mean, you can, if somebody needs one, if there's one song on an album where I think I need stems, that for me, I can do that as part of the overall price, and I'm quite comfortable with that. If what can happen is that when a client hears what is achievable with stems, they then say, well, in that case, can I send you this and this and this and this? And at that point, my reply is pretty much always, yes, absolutely, but it's going to cost you more, because it just working with stems is just that much more time consuming. You know, so you're looking about an extra 50%. If I did an album from the outset, somebody comes in and says, I want to give you stems. Now, I always say I would prefer you to give me stereo mixes, but if they're like adamant, again, who are we to say that they're wrong? But you know, and I mean, occasionally you might get a project where actually you think, I don't even want to work on the stems of this because I'm never going to get it to where I think they want it to go from these raw ingredients. So at that point, you know, I'm sorry, my schedule's too full. But more often than not, again, it's like the high initial starting price. If you say, absolutely, I can work from stems, but it's going to cost at least 50% more than I originally quoted you because of the extra time involved, then you get two reactions. You know, they're kind of like, okay, yeah, that sounds good. Or, whoa, okay, let's work with the stereo. And at that point, you know, I kind of say to them, you know, well, look, you probably don't need stem. Lots of people think they need that kind of thing and they don't. So then you can say, well, you know, let's see how we go. If there's a particular song where I think I need stems, I'll ask you for it and we'll go forward like that. But yeah, it's a question of establishing thresholds, and you start to get an instinct for it. And every so often it goes wrong, you know, and I end up doing a ton more work and not feeling able to. That's the key. The key is to be clear in the communication, is to, at the point where you start to think, this is taking way more time than I had hoped, then you need to have the conversation. And I think, like I say, a good way to do that is to say, well, I can do this, but from now on it's going to cost X. And maybe you lose out a little bit on that, but going forward, you're clear. The problems always come if you, for whatever reason, you don't say that, because then you've done one set of stuff for free. And then it's, well, why can't you do this next thing? And why can't you do this next thing? And it, you know, and often that's a conversation that only happens in your head. The client might actually be completely happy if you said, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to start charging a bit extra. But yeah, those are the things to avoid. So you just kind of need to have your own personal
It's
scale.
kind of a statement. It's kind of a statement that needs to be like put on the page and when you have the conversation with the client. So that's a good point you bring out.
Yeah, absolutely. And just while I'm thinking about it, the other thing that I do, which is unusual, but I've never had anybody complain about it, is I ask for payment up front. Yeah. I don't always follow through with that, but I ask for it because there's one time in particular I was bitten and it took somebody 8 months to pay me. And it wasn't really a problem, but it just it feels bad, you know, and it created a really bad, it made me feel bad, and it created bad feeling between me and the client. And it was a project that I'd enjoyed working on. I was really into it musically, and I thought we got a great result. And it was just a shame. So, and again, that's another, you know, there are some people who they won't entertain that. And so I guess I lose a couple of clients that way. But for them to go into it knowing that that's what I expect, and for them to be prepared to do that, it's just a good position to be in. And, you know, you don't have to be that extreme. It can be 50% upfront, which is kind of more normal.
Yep.
But I read, I can't remember where it was, a blog post by somebody that said, ask for payment up front. And I thought I would try it. And like I said, I've never had a problem with it. So that can also be, you know, helpful. It's pretty rare for me to get into a tangled up situation with people about money these days. Although I probably only get about half the jobs that I quote for. So maybe I'm doing myself a disservice.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
When you say upfront, do you mean before you start working or before the delivery of the product?
Before I start work.
Okay.
Yeah. Which, so actually what I tend to do is if they agree to that, I will then usually, because I mean, I've said before that I always do, if I'm doing an album remotely for a new client, I always master one song first. And, you know, we have a conversation about that, and that's to kind of set the tone, and that in the rare occasions where actually what I think something should sound like and what they want it to sound like are completely different and we can't reach an agreement, that means that I haven't mastered an entire album and feel like I should be paid even if they don't like it, which is a tough situation to be in. But yeah, quite often I will do that demo without asking them for payment. You know, I'm kind of breaking my own rule there. At some point, I'm going to get burned on that. You know, so I will have not charged somebody, and then I'll end up not getting paid for that for that demo track, but it's not the end of the world.
No, but I guess you could send an MP3 or something.
Yeah, it's I don't mind sending. I mean, sometimes the thing is, I don't actually do demos anymore. I used to do. Anybody who wanted to work with me is like, yeah, I'll do your free track. And at that point, I would fade them out about a minute early from the end, so they could hear the full quality version. And I was just finding that so time consuming. That's another. I set all these unreasonable boundaries for people who want to work with me these days. It's like, yeah, you have to. There's no demos, and you have to pay me up front, and I'm really expensive. But it works. I mean, because again, they get effectively they get a demo, right? Because even if somebody paid me up front and I do the first track for them and we go around the houses and decide that it's not going to work, I'm not the right person to do the album for them, I then refund them the money. So effectively they get a demo. But I'm just, not mastering single songs and not just kind of doing on spec. Because the other thing I hate is that you're in a shootout and you don't know it. The number of times that I've mastered something and lost out because, and they kind of say, yeah, we just like the other guys. It was a little bit more punchy. And I go, right. Did you level match them when you did your compare? No, why? It's, or you get into that whole conversation about loudness before you even start work. And it's because, there's in that demo situation, people come to you, they just want to hear what you can do. They don't want a huge conversation before you get it. So yeah. That's the way that I work.
And that was something that, sorry, I'm taking this many questions.
No, go for it.
It's how do you, like Theodore was saying, how do you deliver these things? And you said that you caught at some point. Usually when you're like, in your case, you have been in experience and all that. Us that are a little bit newer, people are going to go like, I want to hear it out. I was looking into Hoffa's DDP player. Is that helpful on how you can deliver something to a client, but they cannot extract it so that they hear the full quality of the player, and not necessarily until they pay, they can get it from you? Does that work?
I actually don't know. I have the same thing, but the Sonorous version. So I paid, it's like, I think the basic Sonorous DDP player is $60, and I paid about $250. And for that, I get a customized version of my player that I can send to any client and they can install for free. So, because it's actually quite uncommon for people to be able to play DDP files. That doesn't put any kind of, if they have that, they can burn a CD of it and they've got the master and they can write files. And I don't know whether Hoffa, I have a feeling maybe Hoffa will only play the image that you send, and it may be protected in some way, or you may be able to.
I can chip in.
Yeah.
Because I just actually bought it like 10 days ago and started using it. So yeah, you can do that with a Hoffa DDP player. You can just tick a box so the client can only play it and not extract it or not burn a CD. So
that's quite good.
Nice. And it's a lot cheaper than Sonorous. A lot. And you can put your logo in on your web page and such. So it's very nice.
Yeah, that's cool. No, I don't think I certainly wasn't aware of it at the point that I bought the Sonorous.
No, might be new as well.
It could be new. I know they had their plugin for producing DDPs from within a DAW, which again I think is a good feature. So if they know what they're doing, they can get, any DDP image actually is basically raw audio. It's kind of like a bin Q file. If you want to load it as raw audio, take it into an editor and chop off the data, there'll be a blip of data right at the beginning and make a massive click. So it's not a particularly secure format. I don't know whether the Hoffa goes further and encrypts the audio data in some way when they export it like that. But I kind of feel like if you, I think it's simpler to just do something where you don't give them the whole song personally, and safer, because at the end of the day,
I think most people will never go that far, doing what you.
No,
I
I'm
mean,
sure.
they have no idea, basically.
I'm sure you're right, and I think most people are honest. I don't know whether have you had bad experience.
Sometimes well, I don't know if you guys know, but I'm located in Latin America. And there's several people, not everybody, like you said, like we always said, it's only little drops of the ocean that makes things a little bit harder. And there's like 4 experiences that this happened. And I'm just like looking to, like you said, put maybe a sound, like a watermark in one sound that I might have, or that it says the name of the studio or whatever, so that they can hear it fine. They can listen to a specific high point, but maybe take out the intro, take out the outro, or something like that. Like, because if the intro is really important, obviously we're gonna have to have it there. But it's going through that thought, and I was looking into the whole DDP, so I was kind of wondering if this could happen, because I would like always the client to have as the complete song with nothing that disturbs their perception of what it is, but with a little bit of security that even you pay up front 50%, that's fine. I might lose 50%, but in the end, get that kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
I can understand that. It sounds like the Hofer could be a good option in that case. You know, I've heard people do stuff with watermarks. For me, that's all just too much hassle.
Yeah.
I mean, it's even too much hassle for me. There's another reason I don't do demos anymore, because I mean, one of the other things you get is that people don't actually want to rip off your audio. They just want to find out what you would do, and then copy. You know, just to find out how loud you would master it, whether you would add bass or not. So they're kind of trying to use it to effectively get a free mastering critique. So, and you know, there comes a point where you can't kind of worry about that stuff. But I mean, 4 times that you've been bitten is more times than I have. So yeah, I mean, I'm so lazy. I couldn't even be bothered to drag the fades around because it would annoy me, because I'd get this version that was the perfect thing, and I'd go, okay, now I need to create a shorter one, and I'd export it, and then I'd either forget to put it back and have to redo the fade at the end, or I'd put it back and it'd be wrong, or, you know. So it's another reason why I stopped doing demos. But you know, like as you say, because I'm established, I'm lucky that I can do that, and people will put up with it. So yeah, sounds like. So how much is the Hofer, Sigurður?
I think it was around 69 euros or so. I can just check it out.
And is that the one for the one that you can distribute to anybody?
Yeah, it's called the DDP Player Maker.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
And it costs. I'll just paste the link. I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, 69.90. So yeah, 70 euros basically.
Yeah, that's a lot cheaper. That's good.
Yeah.
And does that they can check stuff like ISRCs and CD text and all that kind of stuff?
Everything.
I think everything, but I usually send a separate file for the CD text. But yeah, probably.
Yeah, cool.
yeah, it says here. It says custom splash screen logo can be added. Custom info text and link can be added to player. Playback of DDP 2.0 for CDA, CD text, UPC, EEN, ISRC. If they want, and you allow them, burn DDP images to CD and that type of things.
That's good. I mean, I said so one disadvantage is, I think I always encourage people to listen to the master that I've done for them on the widest range of systems. And obviously, if you restrict playback to only from within the player because you're concerned about piracy, they can't do that. So, and the disadvantage of that can be that if they have, typically they will install this thing on the same computer that they mixed it on. And, you know, one kind of challenge we have as mastering engineers, you would hope that the master that we do is going to sound better to them, even on their own system where they mixed it themselves. But in particular, if there's some odd issues in that room, which we correct for, that could then make it sound strange to them on that system. And when that happens, you know, the next stage is always, well, take it out, listen to it in your car, listen to it on your friend's stereo, listen to it on your hi-fi, wherever. And And yeah, if you're controlling where they can take but in that case, yeah, if that happened, you could then take the step of sending them a shortened mix or whatever. So they've heard that full version themselves, and then they get the protected version from you if you want to let it out into the world for some reason.
Just make them pay and carry on.
Well, yeah, there is that.
I have to say, I sent lately player of Hoffa with DDP or DDP with a Hoffa player to the client, and it worked perfect. You know, it would just in no time install. He could burn CDs, and I find after all, you know, that we gotta trust each other. There are always, you know, bad guys and good guys, but most of the time, what I find the most important is if the client doesn't have to call me back how to burn CD, you know, the tracks on CD, or you know, and what's great about in this case Hoffa, because I just purchased it lately, that they can also look if the text is correct, you know, some misspelling stuff, because you know it can happen, so they can actually check the whole thing, included music, and say if they're satisfied or not. So I have to say, you know, if I can make a client happy with a player, that it's installed in no time, everything is there, it's fine with me.
I agree, and I actually think it's a slightly superficial point, but I think it's impressive to people if you send them the master in a file format. Most people haven't heard of DDP before, so the fact that you send them a master file and they need your player, and it's your player, you know, probably with your logo in it, and you give it to them for free, I think that's a really nice confidence building exercise. You know, and I mean, of course, it should all be about the music, and there should be no psychology involved in this at all. But you know, at the end of the day, to some extent, we're marketers and salespeople for our services. So I think all of those things are worthwhile. So yeah, sounds like Hoffa is the way to go.
Yeah, I'm going to be grabbing that.
Do you not have it, Mike? I thought you already used it.
No, I have the Hoffa DDP creator, but not the player.
Oh yeah, okay.
And I actually don't like it, so I don't use the creator.
Okay.
I use DSP Quattro instead.
Right. Yeah, there's DSP Quattro. I don't remember whether you talked about this on the last Hangout. There's that. Sonorous make one, but it's pretty expensive. I don't know how flexible it is with crossfades and stuff. And I just export stuff straight out of Wavelab. But all of this stuff is coming for you in the final video this Friday. So then you can find the bits that you don't understand from that and get back to me with more questions. Let's quickly do Gautier's other two questions. He says, why do some limiters introduce harshness more than others, even with flat settings? And is there a perfectly transparent limiter on the market? So do those in reverse order. No, there's not a perfectly transparent limiter on the market by definition, because perfectly transparent means it doesn't change the signal. That's not a very helpful answer. So are there limiters that can achieve a certain degree of limiting in a very transparent way? Yes, absolutely. You know, I think the ozone limiter is capable of it. I think the Pro L fab filter is capable of it. I like the TC limiter that you get in the power core that you can't buy anymore. It's less transparent, I would say, but you can still get fantastic results with it. There are people who talk very highly about the Mac DSP stuff and the Massey limiter. I think there are a ton out there, actually. I mean, I've also the limiter that comes in the T-Rex is pretty good. You know, for 3-4 dBs of gain reduction. With all of these things, you start to push it further than that, and I think you're probably doing more than maybe you should musically, and you need to balance the compression and the limiting to get the ideal thing. And I'm always of the opinion that if you're pushing the limiter so hard that the actual sonic characteristics of the limiter become crucial to the result you get, you're probably pushing it too hard. To go to the other part of your question, why some limiters introduce harshness more than others, I might be wrong about this, but I suspect you're talking about the Slate FGX, because that, to me, firstly, it's not a limiter, it's a clipper. It's a sophisticated clipper. I don't think it's perfectly decent piece of kit, providing you don't want to go too loud. My problem with it is that all of the stuff that Stephen Slate talks about in terms of retaining transient impact and keeping the sense of dynamics and all the rest of it, the way that it achieves that is by allowing a certain amount of distortion into the signal. That means two things. One is that if you don't like the distortion, it's not going to sound good to you. And the other one is that when you start to push it harder, for me, it starts to give up the ghost much too quick. It gets too distorted for me too quickly to achieve results that are any louder than anything else that's out there. So I don't think the claims that it's better than X, Y, Z stand up. It's just different. And sometimes it's a flavor that you might want. Personally, I would use a different clipping algorithm rather than actually an entire processor that works based on clipping. So I'd use a combination of clipping and limiting. But that's one example of a limiter that I'm saying that I haven't checked it that carefully on its default settings. But whenever I've tried to use it, I've always got to a certain thought point and just not been happy with the amount of distortion that it introduces. Partly, again, there are lots of mastering engineers out there who are happy to introduce way more distortion than I am. I kind of, like I said in the podcast this week, the mastering maxim is probably do no harm. And for me, adding distortion should be a creative decision because it benefits the music, not something that just happens as a byproduct of lifting the level. If you weren't talking about the FGX Gautier, then I think probably the more general answer to why some limiters sound harsher than others is just it's the way that they work, and I think it's probably due to distortion. Some limiters introduce more distortion into the signal than others. When they do, we usually perceive it as harshness in the sound. I usually do. And the downside, I can't remember whether I've recommended it on the course yet or not. There is a video, let me paste a link, where I compare the different sounds of limiting versus hard digital clipping versus soft clipping. And that might be helpful if you haven't already seen it. Have I already referred to that in the show notes of one of the? Nobody's saying yes, you have.
I remember this. You were also introducing Melda limiter in this video.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, it's quite old. Okay, here it is. It's quite a simple link. And I mean, it's just 3 examples. Oh, now I don't have the, okay. Sigador, I'm going to post it in the chat. If you could, I don't know, can everybody, you guys who are in on the call will be able to see that. Maybe you could post that into the YouTube comments, please, to the chat symbol to the right of the, because I don't think that's connected to this chat. Say no if not.
I don't have the YouTube thing.
Okay, let me get the YouTube thing up then. That's the noise I make to tell people I'm doing something.
Thinking noise.
Yeah, I also do it when I'm parking. Oh, YouTube, where do I find the, okay, history, live events.
Oh yeah, I have it.
Live control room, view on watch page. Here it comes.
Oh, you can see it in Gmail, I think. Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's there.
Pavel says in that something about it's not. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean by that, Pavel. If you can tell me in more words, you mean something's not working or you can't get into the Hangout? You want to put another comment? If you're still here and you want to put another comment in there, I'll take a look in a minute and see if I can solve that for you. So yeah, the point about that video is just to show that there are different things sound differently, and you can choose to use different processes for that reason. And it becomes a matter of taste. And the same thing is true of the choice of limiter. So, that's what I was going to say. So what that video shows is that often if you have something that's heavily limited, it will kind of soften the sound more because it's controlling those transients. And whereas a clipper, everything just slams up into it and gets clipped, either musically or not, depending on the settings and depending on how you've got it set up. A reason for using clipping is to retain more apparent punch, just like Stephen Slate says. But the compromise is that's at the expense of distortion, inevitably. So, those become creative decisions in the mastering process, just like everything else. So hopefully that answered your question, Gauthier. Final question from him. I noticed you're using around 100 milliseconds for attack and release times. Could you explain your idea, the concept behind it? Yeah, I think I've answered this before, so I'm not going to spend too long on it, but it's basically limiters are good at handling short-term stuff, transients. Compressors are not good at handling those things unless we set them to have a very high ratio and a very fast attack time, at which point they effectively become limiters anyway. So what I'm suggesting on this course is you have a compressor with longer attack and release times that controls what I would like to think of as the body of the sound, the note, the musical note, and that will let the transients go through almost untouched, but then the limiter controls the transients. Where things start sounding bad is if you try and use a limiter to control the body of the note, because typically a limiter is a very aggressive way of controlling the gain, and typically what you get is that the effect is too aggressive to work musically, unless you're going for a kind of crunchy, distorted sound. And on the flip side, the compressor, if you reduce the attack times and the release times down, typically it doesn't sound as good as a limiter would have done if you'd have used it, and it will start to blunt the transients and take away from the punch and the life and the impact of the sound. So rather than trying to only use one or the other, I recommend you use both. And then you can get the best of both worlds, because you can balance the limiting with the compression and vice versa. That's something I talk about more in the mastering with multiband compression videos. So if that answer doesn't give you enough information, that might be another possibility, to take a look at that and see whether I think there's some demonstrations in the video that goes with that. And if not, you might want to hang on for my forthcoming, at some point, new product, home mastering compression and limiting, where that's definitely going to be an important topic that I'm going to be showing. It's kind of one of the foundation aspects of what I'm going to be demonstrating, in fact. So that covers Gauthier's questions. I'm just going to go back to the YouTube window and see whether Pavel was still here and has elaborated on what wasn't working for him. He says no problem, so I guess that was fixed. Good, glad about that. So I'll close that to save my bandwidth. Okay, good. That was all the questions I had. Does anybody here have any other follow-ups they wanted? Yeah.
Again.
Yeah.
There's a new way in electronic music introduced by Native Instruments that it's called stems. I know we know stems in the regular fashion for mixing and all this, but the new Tractor introduced a way of people performing and enabling DJs to have more things. So the stem producer is something that gets them the information for drums, bass, synth lines, and vocals. So that when you're transitioning between things, you can use, let's say, the bass line of this, and then the bass, and then the drums of another song. When we try to offer this idea to electronic musicians and, I don't know, producers, when we do the stem part for them, as they might be used in something else. I remember in your video towards stems, you said, let's try to Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, because I might be a little bit bad. And how you take the song and you try to affect everything mostly in the same way, so that when you hear the song completely together, they can have the same feeling and the same, I don't know, perception of the song. But for this, let's say, I don't know why, this hasn't happened, but let's say someone says, I don't like that bass line because it sounds amazing, but I want it to be harder because when I use it with this other song, it has to sound this way. Should we create a separate version and tell them, okay, I charge you by this 4 stems, making this, it can be part of a promotional something, but make sure they're not to use them together because this may sound bad. Is that something we could do? Is it might lead to problems? Because I'm seeing people use this stem part a lot, and you can offer it to different like Beatport or track source where their stems and people can buy them and you can charge a little bit more.
I haven't really used the Native Instruments stems format. You might want to, I don't know, there was a conversation about this in the Facebook group today.
Oh, really?
And Ian Stewart, who was in with us on the last Q&A and who's my guest on the mastering show this week, has used it. So he would be a great person to ask for details. In terms of the general idea of kind of, so a common thing that people want, for example, is they want the CD audio version and then they want a high-res version for mastered for iTunes or for uploading to other streaming services. Another situation that I get a lot is people want radio edits where they have a shorter version of the same song, or it's had bad language taken out or whatever, or they have an instrumental. I tend to judge all of that stuff by how much work is involved for me. So in terms of exporting somebody 24-bit files, it takes 10 minutes. I just press a button and it happens. So I'm happy to do that for free. If it's multiple mastered versions of the same song with the same settings, again, I just swap the audio, I make copies, swap the audio in. It's an easy fix. I don't have to charge for that. Even something like an instrumental version, if I'm doing it with exactly the same settings, that's fine. There's a slightly different situation where if somebody actually wants the instrumental version to stand up, and it's, there's one thing where they want it for an a cappella vocal to be added. There's another one where they want it to stand up in its own right, and often then the mastering settings won't work, because if you take the vocal out, that can leave a hole in the frequency range that you want to then actually fill out. So at that point, that then for me becomes a separate master, so I charge extra. So if you're saying they're asking for, say, 2 different versions of the bass line, I would say, if it's going to take you more than 10 seconds to produce that other version, I would then personally be looking to charge them for that decision-making process. In terms of, I don't know how you would prevent them from using that outside of the context. Sounded like you were asking if you do something specific for one use case, how would you stop them combining that with a different version where it didn't work?
That's
so well?
The thing. Well, I cannot. I know we cannot stop them, because in the Native Instruments tractor program, the DJ program, it has a certain below. They have a part where it tells you can hear the drums of every single song you got in stems, hear the bass, hear the synths, and hear the vocals. So you can select button by button how to combine them. So usually, if let's say they play the 4 of that song, but they put the 1 with 1 decibel extra and more punch, and all of a sudden they say that's not how he promised it was going to sound, because what he sent me was this type of. I can tell him, hey, it's because you have to use, let's say, bass A to match everything else and sound perfect. But if you want more punch, use this one if you want to match it with other songs. So that was kind of my thought. Is because in there you can. That was the idea under stems, being able to give DJs separate parts so that you don't use the equalizer, more on separating, but more on enhancing different parts of different songs.
It sounds to me like an education thing for the client. You know, I think if somebody is requesting something in stems format or for use for stems, they have to be aware. We have to make them aware, if they're not already aware, that basically they relinquish control of how it will sound in certain situations. And I think we can only guarantee to, you know, we can say to them, listen, if you play this back with everything flat, the 4 original stems, whatever it was, without changing any settings, it's going to sound the way that you expect it to. If anybody plays it back in any other way, all bets are off, right? Because, you know, I mean, even if you had something that was, if they combine something that's really dynamic with something that's really compressed or whatever, those things may or may not work in different situations. So yeah, I think you just have to be clear about what they can expect, which can be tricky, I know. But I think I would imagine they must come into it knowing that the stems format is, the whole point of it is flexibility and creativity. You know, and at that point, when somebody decides to get flexible or to get creative with what you're doing, they can't expect it to sound or to necessarily work, because you can't anticipate in advance all the different situations. I mean, it's bad enough mastering where you're trying to anticipate how it's going to sound on the widest possible range of playback systems, let alone if you're kind of saying, well, how can I optimize this so that it sounds great, whether the bass line is there or not? I don't think you can. You know, at that point, it's the creative decision of the person, of the VJ, to say, well, this bass line sounds great with these drums or not. But the other thing I would say is do ask in the Facebook group, because there may be ways of locking down stem files to restrict, I don't know, certain features to certain users, which might be helpful. But I think ultimately, I think that's their problem, not your problem. You know, if they give you a specific thing and say, okay, we want you to do a version of this bass line that sounds great with these, and a version of it sounds great with these, that's doable. If they're saying we want a version that's going to sound great when you combine it with everything out there in the world, that's just, you know, we can't do that. Pavel, you're muted. I will unmute you. I can't unmute you. You should be able to unmute yourself by going up to the thing at the top. Late night here, sorry. Did you have a question, or are you just joining in for the fun? To follow that. Okay, cool. So the only bad news is I think we're pretty much done. Unless anybody else had any other questions. It's getting quite late here and my toothache is starting to come back. So I'm happy to answer another question or two if anybody wants me to, but otherwise I think we might call it an evening.
Last one.
Yeah.
Before you collapse, probably. I had lately, while mastering this thing, that my compressor would mostly limit or compress the middle range. And it was, you know, the mix was made like the old jazz mix, coming to jazz again. But what is very typical, that there is not much going on in the low part of the mix. And I would hear something that I would like to glue a little bit more in the low register, but I just didn't know how to get there, because, you know, the sound wouldn't get wouldn't push the compressor in the low mid band or low band. Do you have any idea how could I achieve that? Just to glue a little bit more?
It's there are several ways of doing it. So it's a multi-band compressor, yeah?
Yeah.
So the way that I tend to do it is to not mess too much with the thresholds in the multi-band compressor and EQ the signal. So if you EQ more bass into the signal, that low band will start to become more active.
Mhm.
because you're effectively lifting the level, but that may not have the EQ effect that you would like.
No, because I was afraid that the client will not be happy with me putting more low in the mix. That's it.
Sure. In which case, there are two options which are equivalent. Either you reduce the threshold in the low band to the point where it starts to have the effect that you're looking for, but then you reduce the output gain of that low band to turn it. So let's say if you pull the threshold down by 8 dBs, probably the input gain will, the overall gain of that, depending on how the compressor works, will probably lift up by 8 dBs. Or if it doesn't, you'll just start to hear some compression, and effectively that band will become a little bit quiet. So instead you'll have to turn it up. Anyway, basically you're talking about tweaking the post gain of that band on its own. So you'd have to disable the link function, because I normally recommend you use the bands linked, so you have the same settings in each band. So you either reduce the threshold, or you push up the input gain, or you use EQ to lift up the level, and then again you tweak it afterwards to get the effect that you want. There's something that I used to do. I mentioned it in the Mastering with Multiband Compression ebook. I used to do fairly often. I don't do it so much these days, but is to get a lot more compression happening in the high frequency band than in any other band, but then pull the level back. And that was a strategy we came up with. There was, I don't know whether you could, right, yeah, you can see it. That purple box set up there is the immediate box set. So that's every single ever released on Andrew Loog Oldham's immediate record label. So that included early stuff by Fleetwood Mac, the Stones, not Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but the Nice, which is what they were before they were Emerson, Lake and Palmer. A whole load of stuff. Really nice project to work on. And that was unusual because we were given a complete vinyl set of reference copies, all of the original releases on vinyl, plus the master tapes wherever they had them, plus CD reissues. And we basically had to assess for each song which was the source that we were going to use and which one would get closest to what that original vinyl had sounded like. And sometimes that meant actually using the vinyl. In a couple of cases, like there's one, we had First Cut is this is a tangent, but I think it's quite an interesting one. We had First Cut is the Deepest by P.P. Arnold, and we discovered that every single CD reissue to that point had used the wrong version of the song. They'd used a different take, completely different take than the one that was on the actual single. And the one that was on the single was so much better. It was just like a different performance. Anyway. But the other thing we found is the fascinating thing was in some cases, the master tape sounded so much better than the vinyl. In some cases, the CD sounded so much better than the vinyl. In some cases, the vinyl sounded so much better than any other source. For me, that's whenever anybody tells me digital is better, vinyl is better, analog is better, that's the example I cite. It's like, no, it's all about what's on the format, not the format. But particular case that relates to this conversation is quite a few of those. We would listen to them and they had this lovely kind of soft, present top end without any kind of spiky, nasty spikiness. So they sounded toppier than either the master tapes or the CD reissues. But you didn't get that effect just by pushing the top end up. If you just lifted the top end to balance, it sounded much more spiky and kind of uncomfortable and wrong. And the solution we came up with was to heavily compress the high frequencies using a multiband. And I suspect that was exactly what was done in the vinyl cutting stage. Some kind of frequency-dependent compression processing. Could have been a de-esser. Not sure what they would have used back in the day to achieve that effect. But yeah, you ended up with lots more dynamic control in the high frequency band than you would have in the other bands. But then you rebalanced the level of it afterwards so that it still sounded overall suitable for the material. So, and I think what I'm suggesting to you is you do exactly the same thing, but in the bass end. and I've done it sometimes. You get something where the kick drum is much too loud. For example, you can use quite heavy compression in the low frequency band of a multiband compressor, so that the kick drum gets really squashed. The bass line, relatively speaking, when you squash the kick drum down, the bass line and the kick drum are a much more similar level, and then you lift the whole thing up so that they sit more nicely together. Or you have the opposite effect where you do that, but then you turn it down so that the bass doesn't overwhelm everything else, but the bass is generally more controlled, which I think is what you're asking about. So that would be my suggestion. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that actually, have you heard other stuff that they've had released after they've had it? Do you know for a fact that they're going for that classic kind of old school jazz sound?
That's the first record they made, and as a reference strength, I got old Blue Note stuff, which it doesn't really have like 50 hertz stuff going on, basically, because it was just all raw acoustic recorded instrument. At least that's the way I hear it, and I see it.
Yeah, no. So in that case, I think that's fairly clear. I'm always tempted to take things a little bit closer to a more modern sound when I get that vintage, but it's kind of difficult because usually I don't know that I get that many things that are emulating that sound. It's more, I guess my experience is more of remastering stuff from that era, at which point you kind of have this balancing act between how much does it sound like the original release and to what extent do you, I mean, to go to the opposite extreme, I didn't hear it, but at one point there was a set of Elvis reissues where I think they got loads of complaints about the remastering because they had added loads of bass, which, you know, was there in the signal but wasn't really coming through on the original releases. And however great it may or may not have sounded, people were annoyed because it just didn't sound like Elvis anymore.
People get used to sounds even if it's bad.
Yeah, and I mean, I would be, or even, I mean, it's not even whether it's bad, but it's just I would be the same if I was given Sign of the Times by Prince to remaster. That era, his sound in that era had a lot less super low and super high frequencies in it. You know, my mastering kind of head would be tempted to lift those frequencies up to just have it a more even frequency balance and make it better represented. But the bit of me that loves the way that those records originally sounded would be fighting against with that. So it's always a question of balance. How far do you go or not to do that? But yeah, that would be the thing to try, and it should work. If there's no reason why that wouldn't work.
Now, I was kind of very anxious about that because I saw one of your videos about multiband compression, and I totally agree. If you work too much with the levels of separate bands, you might really bring a mix in like a caricature, is that the word?
Yeah. Of
the mix. You might end up with this. So I'm actually pretty dogmatic about that, not touching, the levels. And
the thing is, I mean, if you use a multiband compressor on a mix and it has more mid-range content than anything else, it'll end up having a slight EQing effect anyway. You know, if you have kind of a 2-to-1 ratio active in the mid band, but not in the low and the high, you're going to hear a little bit more of those low and high frequencies. One of the nice things about multiband is quite often you just put something through it, and because it holds the midband in a little bit, some of the highs come out more. You hear more of the high frequencies come out, so you kind of get a sort of a slight EQing effect as a by process of using it. And definitely overdoing it can be one of the bad things about multiband. But so in some senses, I don't think you should be too, I mean, I think do you have perception?
Yes.
So you can, my advice would be just to use it, to play around, do whatever it is you think, kind of put your theoretical objections to one side for a minute, mess around and get something that you think you like, and then use perception to A/B. And I suspect you'll find it's a lot closer than you thought it was. Especially if you have that goal in mind and you then tweak the settings to to get the result you want, I think the chances are you'll be able to get something that has the effect you want without kind of doing something outrageous. Because I think it's quite, you know, the number of times I've gone through a whole half-hour mastering process with a song, put perception in, and when they're level matched, there's hardly any difference. So what I've achieved is getting it to sound pretty much like it always did, but louder, which I know kind of sounds slightly opposite to what I'm always saying, but actually, you know, providing it's in the sweet spot, there's going to be a benefit to that. And if it sounded great anyway, you know, there's not a problem with it. So yeah, I think I agree. Well, I mean, obviously I agree with those theoretical concerns because I've expressed them, but at the same time, you know, I think there's certainly no harm in experimenting with it and seeing how it sounds. And if you can get it to the point where you A/B in perception and it just sounds the same but better, then, you know, you're good to go, I think.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Cool. Okay. Well, I can definitely feel my tooth kicking in now. So I'm going to call a halt on this occasion. Thank you very much to everybody for being here. I've enjoyed it as always. Great questions, great Q&A. I hope you enjoy the final video, which comes out on Friday. And do feel free to follow up if you have any questions from that. I probably won't. I'll see how many questions we get. If there's enough questions, I'll run another Q&A. But usually, most people have had things answered by this point. So if you have any other questions, I'll probably reply individually by email. But we'll see how it goes. And there is another bit of bonus content to come after the final video as well. So you've still got a little bit of time to go before the course reaches its end. But yeah, thanks again. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the course.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Bye.